Hello and welcome to this video on the Tableau Certified Data Analyst. We're going to be talking about replacing a connected data source with another data source for an existing chart or sheet. And when we're going to go through this, we're going to first do a demo and then I'm going to explain the steps. So before we get into that, I do want to show the documentation. I have a screenshot of the official documentation. I'm going to place a link to this documentation with the video. And now let's get into it. Let's do the demo. So I'm going to switch over to Tableau Desktop here. And I have this sample superstore open and I've put the orders data in and I'm just going to start a worksheet here and I'm going to use the segment and the sales. And so if you notice, the segment has consumer, corporate, and home office. And I'm going to change that by going over to this file, making a copy, and I'll call this edited, this new version. And I'm just going to change this segment from corporate to business. Right, so I'm going to do like a find and replace on that column. So it's going to take just a second to open this file up. And then I'm going to go over to segment here, highlight it. I got to enable editing first. Just going to take me a second to make this change. Right, and so now I'm going to do Control H and replace the word corporate with business. Right, and so do a replace all. That's going to make 3020 replacements. Did that. Click close. Save it, close it, and then I'm going to open up this new data source in Tableau. So it's the same as the original, but just with that one change, replacing corporate with business. And so I'm going to do a new connection, add a new connection to this edited version. And so I'm going to do a new data source. Oops, I should have done that first. Okay, so now I've got this second data source here. Okay, and so now I've got orders and orders edit, right? I've got these two different ones. And so if you look at orders edit, that one should have corporate rather than, it has business rather than corporate, right? If I look at the original one, that one has, if I go over to this segment, it's got corporate, right? And so, whereas the edited version instead has the word business in this segment column here, right? So you see that as an example. So if I go over to sheet 2, right, I'm using the original data, orders from Sample Superstore. If I want to switch to my edited version, I would just click on this here and see, basically go up to data. And then under here, I do replace data source right there. So I select the data, first data, then I select the table name, and then I go replace data source, and I get this menu that says I'm going to replace the current data that this worksheet's using, which is orders, with this new orders sample superstore edit. So I click OK, and when I do that, I'm going to see the word corporate change over to business. And so now you see that happen. This now says business before it said corporate. Now if I do Control Z, it'd switch back, right? Control Z undoes that. Control Y redoes it, right? So, and you can see it switch which data source has the little check mark next to it, right? So right now I'm using the edited version with business. If I do Control Z, it would switch me back to using the original sample superstore, right? So that's how I switch from one data source to another. It is not complicated, right? You have to have a worksheet in your workbook and you're switching the source that worksheet is using, right? So it's switched from using the original sample superstore to using the edited. I do just want to review, like I was saying, the step. We go on to take a look at the steps. The first step is to open the workbook and make a connection that has a connection to the original data source. And then after that, we go over to select data, new data source, and add a new data source, right? So the first thing we need to do after opening the workbook is we need to add that data source that's going to become our replacement data source, right? So we have to do that, set up that new data source. On the data sources page, we drag a table over to the canvas so that to finish setting up that data source. Then we go to the sheet where we want to make the replacement, right? And on that sheet, we do data, and then we find the data source and we select replace data source. And so I did that, I went through that and made that replacement. There's a note here. It says you must have at least one field in the view to make the replace data source option available, right? If I have a view like this, neither of these data sources is actually being used, right? So there's nothing to replace. But if I take, for example, region into this view, now it says, oh, region, and that's region coming from orders, right? It's not region coming from sample superstore, it's region coming from orders. And then if I did, go over to data and replace, then it would switch and use the other data source, right? So if I do replace data source like that, now it's switched over, right? But the only reason we would need to do that is if we were already using one of the data sources in the view and we wanted to switch it out for the other. Right now, I'm not really using any data source in this view. That doesn't happen until I start dragging fields into some part of this view. That's why there's this note. You must have at least one field in the view to make the replace data source option available. And then finally, in the replace data source dialog box, select the current data source and the replacement data source. In this particular case, there's only 2 data sources, so it's not really relevant. But if you have more data sources, then this would be kind of important to choose the right data sources, right? And then finally, there's a checkbox under the current field if you want to make the replacement in the whole workbook or only in the current worksheet, right? And so when you're finished, you click OK, right? And so that's what I was just demonstrating. You can see that right here, right? If I add something here, and then I do the replacement, go data, replace data source, I get this dialog box. I could make the replacement in all the sheets in the worksheet or only in the current worksheet. By default, it's going to be all of the worksheets in the current workbook. But if you check this, it's only the current worksheet, right? In this particular case, I only have 2 worksheets, so it's not a big deal, and I really haven't done anything. But if you had a worksheet that was using one data source for all sorts of different views, then you could make all the replacements in one shot. All right, so that is it for replacing a data source. Thank you.